There are currently 11 weapons in New World that you can make use of, with some recent additions like Ice Gauntlet or the Lunging Rapier. That was a big step forwards. Okay, that was a bad joke, I'll admit. And you can equip any 2 of them at one time. But despite the wide range of possible combos that opens up, they can all essentially be broken down into really 3 or 4 class types. Those really being Tank, DPS, or Healer. And realistically, I would clump anything else sort of other than that and really consider it to be a hybrid. Now, a few words on hybrids before we really get stuck into each of the 3 classes. Generally speaking, although there are some obvious exceptions which we'll talk about later, for min-maxing builds, hybrids tend to be a bad example. This, an example of this might be something like taking Sword and Shield and then going half tank, half DPS. You sort of end up in a situation that doesn't really fulfill every role. However, not everyone here is going to be playing super competitively. Not everyone cares about the meta and min-maxing, and if that's you, that is absolutely fine. But it is good to try and understand the decisions you're making and remember the impact it's going to have on your character. And at the end of the day, you can always respec or change weapon if you change your mind later on. Next up, I want to briefly talk about attributes and basically how to spec them. This is obviously going to depend a lot on your class and build, but you're going to get 190 attribute points just from leveling once you hit to level 60. But with the addition of high-end gear, I'd expect that you're going to be getting to around 500 total attribute points to play with. So you should be able to fully spec one of your attributes to around 300 and get most of a second attribute, which is part of the reason why good gear is so important, and it's good gear that is specific to the attributes that you want. However, it is also worth bearing in mind that there is an element of diminishing returns for attributes. If you take, say for example, Constitution, that starts by giving you 25 hit points per attribute point at the low levels. But that gradually decreases as you spend more attribute points down to 21 hit points per level for the higher attribute point levels. Yes, it's still good, the diminishing return rate isn't that harsh, but you are losing some of its effectiveness. Finally, it's obviously just worth pointing out that you also get a fixed bonus for every 50 attribute points up to 300. For example, at 50 dexterity you get a plus 10% critical hit chance and plus 10 skinning speed. And finally, you can respec your attribute points for free up until level 20. Beyond that, it's going to be costing you coin. So let's kick things off then with the tank. You've really got 2 primary objectives as a tank. This is the obvious one, tanking. Of course, the clue is kind of in the name. But more importantly, it's actually going to be getting and holding the enemy's aggro through New World's threat system. For every hit you land, you'll generate a small amount of threat, pretty much based on the damage you apply. However, with Sword and Shield, you can make use of abilities like Shield Bash or Defender that increase the amount of threat you generate. You can also combine this with a Carnelian Gem equipped to your weapon to increase your threat, and give some abilities things like Taunt. This will then allow you to attack and hold enemies' aggro indefinitely. This is honestly one of the most important things you can do. There's no point being a tank if all the enemies are attacking your healer, because, for example, other members in the group, like the healer, would generate significant amounts of threat via healing. So you need to be generating more threat than your healer, which is why things like the Carnelian Gem and making use of Shield Bash and Defender are so important. Now, in terms of weapon mastery, I'm not going to cover weapon mastery for each and every weapon, otherwise this video will go on for ages, and we actually have a separate video just on builds already out there. But since tank class is basically built on Sword and Shield, it kind of is worth taking a little bit of a look at it for this specific one. So, broadly speaking, we've got the sort of defensive side and a little bit of offensive on the Swordmaster side. Now there's 2 key abilities on this side, Shield Bash and Defender. So as we were saying, they are both Carnelian Gem compatible, so if you have a Carnelian Gem slotted into your sword's gem slot, then you'll basically gain Taunt, which basically draws all the enemies to you, and that'll run for 6 seconds, which is exactly what you want to be doing. You're the tank, that's the whole point. But on top of that, as we head down the Shield Bash line, we get an increased threat generation from using the Shield Bash, and you get a little bit of an extended bash, which is just nice to have from a combat point of view. Beyond that, we're either looking at defensive or taunt-based abilities. So more damage and cause more threat on your final blow. Again, useful generating that threat. A little bit of defensive, ally support stuff. Then we move over to Defender or Defiant Stance. Then this has Taunt gem compatible. So when you activate the ability, if you have a Cornelian gem in your sword, it's going to cause Taunt, going to draw all those enemies to you, which is hugely useful. And the rest of the stuff is just about basically increasing the effectiveness of the ability. Flicking over to the Swordmaster side, this is your Whirling Blade. This is the one that's actually going to do a little bit of damage. Still not going to be crazy damage. The tank as a class is not about damage, but it's nice to have a little bit of versatility, which is why I think it's worth having a few specs down here. Just gives you a little bit of extra damage and a little bit more sort of flexibility in how you play the class. So that's how I would run it. But for me, it's all about generating the taunt and the threat, which is what the Shield Bash and the Defender actually do, and that's what makes them so key. So what about attributes for the tank class? Well, it's Constitution, and more Constitution, really. You're all about taking damage and staying alive, not really dishing it out. So ideally, you'll be looking to end up with at least 300 points in Constitution. As for sort of any spare points beyond that, you have a few options available to you. Sword and Shield scales primarily off of strength. So if your secondary weapon is going to be something like maybe a Great Axe, a Warhammer, both of which are great secondaries for a tank due to their really high base damage output without being sort of overly reliant on attributes for the damage. But then if you do spec a few extra points of strength into it, that could make them a really good option. And we see quite a few swords and shields with Great Axes and Warhammers. A further option though could be one of my many sort of hybrid exceptions, would be to go Life Staff as a secondary, and so spec your secondary attribute as Focus. I'd try and get a T5 Focus gem as well for my sword to convert a percentage of its damage to basically scale off of Focus, so that at least you're getting some extra damage boost out of the Focus attribute. This sort of heavy armour healing tank is what Sir Medieval has been playing and sort of is calling a paladin. However, in the recent open beta testing, this class suffered a pretty hefty nerf, with healing whilst wearing heavy armour now only giving 80% of the previous healing amount. You have to be basically wearing light armour to get 100%. Along with also nerfs to the T5 Amber Focus gems, it's kind of put a fair dent in this as a class because it certainly was very popular. But hopefully this at least highlights that even as a tank, there are quite a few different options available to you for you to pick from. I guess since we just covered a healer tank hybrid, it makes sense for us to move on to the healer next. I suppose in many ways the tank and healer are two easier classes to spec, at least weapon wise, as your primary is always going to be sword and shield for tank and life staff for healer. But given the recent changes to healing and armor weight as we just talked about above, it is perhaps more safe to assume now that we're going to at least see a lot more light armor healers in the game compared to the sort of very heavy armor orientated healers that we've had before. The goal of the healer is in itself pretty self-explanatory. It's all about keeping your group alive, making sure your tank who has got the aggro of everything in the room is kept up, identifying who is getting targeted quickly in a war, in those 50v50 wars. Once that group of muskets starts turning on a player, they will chunk down super quickly. You've got to be quick in getting your heals out, getting your AoE heals out, and making sure that you keep them up. That's really what being a healer is all about. So in terms of mastery for the life staff, there are actually a couple of options open and available to you, perhaps slightly depending on what armor type you're going to be going. But to cover the two perhaps more standard ones first, of Beacon and Sacred Ground. These are your two AoE abilities. So Sacred Ground, that's the sort of big sort of greenish glowing circle that, when you stand in it, that's what's going to do heal yourself, your allies, basically turning an area of ground into healing. And the passives associated with it are basically extending that, both on Sacred Ground and also on Beacon. Its area of effect, the amount it does, the time and duration that it lasts, all affected by this. Elsewhere, passives are smaller things just affecting the life staff in general. Light and heavy attacks no longer take mana, super useful. Stuff when heavy attacks pass through allies, it removes a debuff. There's another ally one when your light attack, so when you're shooting basically into a cluster, if you pass your light attack through and hit an enemy, then it also heals your own ally. Super useful in large scale PvP, wars, stuff like that. It becomes a really invaluable passive, and that's where these are really handy. Then I would say you've kind of got two options. If you are fairly light armor healer, you've not really got much tank, you've not got much spec into constitution, you're wearing light armor, then I think Divine Embrace is probably the way to go. It gives you a high rapid casting instant heal, basically like an emergency heal that you can make use of. Really kind of handy to have, and it can actually, once you spec it out, end up healing up to 3 people if you're pretty low on health. It basically rebound heals, so if you're below 50% health, then it will heal someone within 8 meters of you, and then if that person's below 50% health, they heal someone with 8 meters of them, so it like rebounds, so you can heal up to 3 people effectively with it. Really, really handy to have and very useful. I think if you're much more tanky, then I think Orb of Protection is also a viable option. Gives you that nice fortify and the healing, really kind of nice to have. And if you're using, say, like Life Staff and maybe Sword and Shield, or Life Staff and another melee weapon like a Great Axe or something, then you can basically shoot yourself, get that Fortify for 20 seconds, flick over to the Great Axe, and then you've got that Fortify on you. It's really nice to have, so you're going into melee with already a boost. But there's a couple of options, I think, available to you. It kind of depends slightly, I think, on how tanky you're going to be going as a Life Staff user. Finally, we come to attribute points, and I guess, as before, it's pretty self-explanatory that you're going to be wanting to stick the vast bulk of your attribute points into focus. Probably around 75% until you get to around 300, then I'll be looking to probably put any remaining attribute points into constitution. Particularly if you're going to be like a light armor healer, you can get chunked down really quite quickly by muskets. You might not be able to get your emergency self heals on in time. Particularly, and again, I know I keep referring back to this, particularly if you get involved in the 50v50 territory wars, you will get chunked down pretty fast and you will actually be a target. Finally, we come on to the, I guess, fairly all-encompassing class of sort of quote-unquote DPS. Really, it's a very broad definition in this game, as there are a really large selection of weapons, well, 9 of them, that really could be categorised as DPS. But in reality, many of them play pretty radically different. Maybe you like the idea of a spear with a strong amounts of crowd control, musket or bow to get that good amounts of ranged damage. If you want a bit more of a support DPS, then maybe something like Ice Gauntlet or Fire Staff. Both offer very large amounts of AoE damage. Can be great in large skirmishes. Rapier, really large amounts of raw DPS with the addition of criticals and evades. Or maybe you just want to cleft someone in twain with the Great Axe. So I guess you could ask the question of, well, why am I sticking them all under the same sort of DPS label? Well, predominantly it's down to their attributes build, because unless you are planning on running weapon hybrids, i.e. weapons that don't share the same primary or secondary attribute, then in most cases I would be looking to put probably 75% of my attribute points into a single damage attribute. By this I mean, say, strength for Great Axe or dexterity for spears, because all of these 9 weapons are really focused towards doing damage in one form or another, like we talked about above. Maybe it's because of AoE or maybe it's through crowd control, but they're all damage orientated. Yes, you could go much more heavily into Constitution, for example, but fundamentally it comes down to the problem of why would you then not just use Sword and Shield? If you want to make yourself tough and tanky, it is hands down the better weapon for it. But to sort of counter my own argument a little bit here, and as I said a little bit at the start, lots of different builds will emerge based on people's playstyle and kind of what they want to achieve and how they want to play the game. And this is just a rough idea of how I'd group the classes and kind of how some of the fundamentals work. There are lots of hybrid options available, and that is what makes the game so cool. But it is kind of helpful to bear in mind that these 3 classes are sort of like your starting point. build your classes out from here, and just keep in mind a little bit about how they work and how they're kind of broadly grouped. Ideally, be trying to pick weapons that share the same primary attribute. Spear and musket, hatchet or great axe, as if you pick two weapons that have opposing attributes, say Warhammer and Ice Gauntlet, then you're really limiting your ability to get good damage out of either weapon. And if nothing else, I'd really like this to be your main takeaway from this video. But anyway, I have rambled on for more than long enough. If you've even made it this far, you've done very well. And hopefully the video has given you at least a little bit more of an idea about which class and weapons you might want to pick going forwards. If you have any questions about builds or classes, put them in the comments down below and I will get back to you. Lots more New World content on the way, so do subscribe, and I shall see you all on the next one.